Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rachel Soicher. I'm an Assistant Director of Research and Evaluation in the Teaching and Learning Lab. And it's my great honor to welcome you all here today for our first in our 2023-2024 speaker series that we put on every year. Before I introduce today's speaker, I'd like to remind everybody of our second event, which is coming up on Thursday, October 26th, also at 1 p.m. We'll be hearing from Dr. Julie Stanton, who's an associate professor of biology at the University of Georgia. And she will share her findings on how disabled students in undergrad STEM courses experience pedagogical practices, for example, the implementation of active learning. So we hope that in addition to joining us today, you'll be able to join us for our next speakers series event as well. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Amanda Diekman. Dr. Diekman is a provost professor at Indiana University, where she also serves as Associate Vice Provost for Faculty and Academic Affairs. Her research investigates how stereotypes stem from and reinforce the social structure, with a particular focus on disparities in STEM interests and predictors of trust in science. Her research has been published in outlets such as Psych Science, Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. She has served as PI or co-PI on multiple grants from the National Science Foundation to support basic research and evidence-informed student programs. She is a fellow of the Association for Psychological Science, the Society for Personality and Social Psychology, and the Society of Experimental Social Psychology. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Amanda Diekman.
Thank you. All right, let me share my screen. Start my slideshow. All right, hopefully you can see that. I'm very excited to be here today to talk to you about this work. My lab is focused on psychology, so I am a social psychologist, which means that I care a lot about how individuals interact with the social structure. I'll talk to you today about work that has occurred mostly in the laboratory within psychology, but as you'll see, we have some work that's extending out and speaks to classrooms, to curriculum, and so forth. And so I'm very excited to be here to talk to you all today. So when we think about students in STEM and building a STEM workforce that is high quality and high quantity, one of the things that is often recommended is to invoke a sense of purpose. So this is a piece that appeared in Nature in 2018, and Jack Leeming here, it has a really nice op-ed essay kind of detailing why meaning is important in STEM and why early career researchers in particular should persevere to find meaning in their work. He notes here that a 2016 report noted that 41% of research professionals say that they're mainly driven by purpose rather than by money or by status. And so at the very least, the sense of meaning that one's work matters appears to be important for people. Some data that we have access to, these are data collected by 3M in their State of Science Index. And so these particular data I'm showing you are of STEM professionals from a nationally representative sample in the United States. And we partition the data by demographics, by gender and race identities. And participants were asked, what is your inspiration for going into the STEM pathway that you've pursued? And so professionals in STEM who've made it through all of the majors and barriers and all of that, what they are reporting as key reasons are being passionate about the field, having a career that's in the respected field, working on solving the world's biggest challenges, and making a difference. And so these are common reasons that rise to the top for many people, but you can also see that there's a pattern in here, that white men who are STEM professionals are clustering around kind of self-oriented reasons of being passionate about the field and having a career in a respected field. And we see white women and Black and Hispanic men and women clustering in this lower quadrant around solving the world's biggest challenges and making a difference. So the question that our lab has been pursuing is thinking about these reasons why students might go into STEM or not go into STEM, and thinking about whether the field signals these reasons, signals opportunities to fulfill these kinds of goals. So in the next 40 minutes or so, I'm going to talk through a number of different questions. I'm going to start with why, thinking about why students are going or not going into STEM is important. We'll think about for whom this might be especially important, to consider what kinds of goals are being signaled by the environment. We'll think about how STEM environments, and by STEM environments, I use that as a term to mean classrooms, curriculum, extracurriculars, workforce pathways, like really within a STEM environment writ large, how are goal opportunities signaled, and how might we do this differently? And then there are two auxiliary questions that really always came up early on, even in my undergraduate training. So what? Like, why does this matter? And what's next is where we'll end, thinking about the next steps. So to start with this kind of why, thinking about goal processes and what environment signal is important and for whom that might be especially important, I want to start with where my lab started now over 15 years ago. And we were looking at data about the degrees women in the United States were earning and the degrees that they were less likely to be earning. So these trends in women's representation, I'm going to show you, are over time, and these are all terminal degrees in a field. And so the y-axis here are percentage of degrees in a particular field that are earned by women. And this is a binary categorization of gender at the time that these data were collected. So what we see is an upward trend for all of these different fields: law, medicine, dentistry, and business, also physical sciences, math and statistics, computer science, and engineering. But you can see that the steepness of those trends differs. So for law, medicine, dentistry, and business, we see that women are at or near gender equality in getting the degrees in the field. But for the science, technology, engineering, and math fields, that trajectory is much lower. Computer science in particular tends to go up and down and doesn't have a fully linear trajectory most recently. So what we wondered, these data made us pause, because at the time that we started doing this work, the explanations for women's lower representation in many fields really focused on stereotypes and barriers about women's competence, and they really focused on self-efficacy and women's sense that they were less competent than men. But these data really challenged the adequacy of those explanations, because law, medicine, dentistry, and business require quantitative skill. They have massive barriers that women have overcome, and yet there is something else differentiating among these fields. So these data in particular led our lab to launch into now many years of collecting both survey data, experimental data, doing some intervention work to understand, well, what is differentiating these fields, and what is the impact on psychological process, and what might we do with that information. This has led us to develop and provide evidence for goal congruity theory. And this theory has a couple of very simple premises. One is that fundamental motivations drive behavior. And so the fundamental motives that we think about come from a long history in psychological science, but there are two major dimensions. One fundamental motive is agency, and those have to do with self-oriented goals, such as gaining power, skill, self-direction. So really moving the self forward as an agent in the world. Another fundamental dimension, and no less important, are communal goals and orientation: helping others in society, working closely with others, being altruistic and pro-social. And so, like I said, a long history within psychological science has documented that these two motives are distinct, that everyone possesses some degree of these motives at different times and in different contexts, and also that they do vary both by individuals and by groups, as we'll see is important. So with regard to the gender disparities in STEM, one of the starting places from the gender literature was that we knew that within the United States and in across the broader globe, women had closed the gap in terms of agentic goals. So women and men report fairly equal levels of wanting to be competent, wanting to have power, wanting to be financially successful. But there's still a gender gap in terms of communal orientation, so that women more than men are likely to report that helping others, working with others, benefiting others is a key and core value to them. This led us to the question of, well, what are these different career contexts perceived to offer people? And so the second key premise of goal congruity theory is that contexts and roles are perceived to afford goals differentially. And we then examined this in terms of STEM roles. So are the goals that are valued by students, both as individuals or in thinking about these gender groups, are those seen as afforded by STEM roles or not so much? What we found, and I'll start here with some survey data collected with a wide swath of undergraduate students across different majors, but with healthy representation from engineering and natural and physical sciences. We simply asked them to consider a number of different careers, and we asked them to rate each career pathway on, does this career, would this let you reach your communal goals and your agentic goals? So they rated each of several different careers on how much would this let you fulfill intimacy, affiliation, and altruism, or power, achievement, seeking new experiences, or excitement. What we find in the y-axis here, ratings could range from 1 to 7 on how much these different career fields would fulfill the goals. We found that STEM fields were perceived as less likely to afford communal goals than agentic goals, and a sizable gap there. And that male stereotypic careers, and those included the things like law, business, medicine that I mentioned earlier, those were perceived as more likely to fulfill communal goals and as likely to fulfill agentic goals. And then female stereotypic careers, these are things like nursing, social work, teaching, where women are highly concentrated. Those were especially likely to fill communal goals and somewhat less likely to fill agentic goals. So in terms of providing a different explanation for those gender disparities that we looked at earlier, it seemed that there's reason to look at communal affordances, especially as being perceived as lacking in STEM, because the major difference that our students were perceiving was in the offerings for communality rather than the offering for agency. So students perceived that they could fulfill their agentic values across a wide range of careers, but if those communal goals were important to them, they saw more opportunity, even in law and business and medicine, much more so than the STEM fields. These basic beliefs about what STEM fields offer in terms of goal pursuit have been replicated, and we find very consensual beliefs. So across age, across gender, across ethnicity, across whether students are STEM majors or outside of a STEM major path, and among people who are training to become science and math educators, we see the same pattern. It does tend to attenuate with more experience in STEM, which I think is a really, really important note that we'll come back to. We also, when we dig into STEM majors and we think about, well, how might different aspects of STEM fields offer or be perceived to offer these goals, we see that this stereotypic pattern of perceptions of less communal opportunity than agentic opportunity is especially prevalent among early, so first or second year engineering and physical science majors. Life science majors, both early and late, tend to see more balance in the communal and agentic offerings in their majors. So then, as I noted, our perspective is very much thinking about not just what individual students value and perceive, but also what the environment is signaling. What is the environment portraying as likely to be pursued and fulfilled in that context? So to examine this, we looked at some markers in life sciences versus engineering and physical sciences environments. We know from the data I just said to you that majors perceive less communal opportunity in early engineering and physical science pathways. And so in our environmental analysis, we looked at two aspects. We looked at the course activities and at physical artifacts in the buildings. So course activities, we analyzed assignments and interactions across Canvas courses, throughout our statewide university system and across several years. And we found that life sciences offered more collaborative activities, discussion boards, peer review than engineering or physical sciences, which is a good indicator that the actual activities of students were differing somewhat. And then we also did an analysis of physical artifacts as displayed on the buildings, reasoning that this is one sign of the culture or subculture of the place. So we had research assistants capture images of every bulletin board in a public space in campus buildings for biology, physics, and engineering. And we then had coders who were blind to where those came from, and some of the information masked, code those for content. What we found is that the depictions that were displayed on campus mirrored exactly what students had told us their perceptions of these goal affordances were. So in life sciences, the bulletin boards tended to include both agentic and communal content, whereas in engineering and physical science, it was really focused on agentic goals more so than communal goals. So what do we do with this information? We know that students can perceive STEM as not affording communal opportunities. We know that environments can signal communal goals. And an important piece is to understand how this matters for students' own interest in, projection of enjoyment, the major, and intent to engage with a STEM pathway or to seek other opportunities where they may see those goals as being more likely to be fulfilled. So in pursuing this question of what is the impact of these perceptions, we adopt two different strategies. I'll also show you some correlational data, which looks at people's pre-existing beliefs. So what are the correlations of having a high communal orientation and your intent to major in STEM? And then we'll also look at experimental evidence, which is important for establishing the causality of these perceptions in students' interests and potential next steps. So in terms of the correlational evidence, here we are looking at whether variation across individuals in their communal orientation is going to predict interest into entering the different career clusters that that we gathered data about earlier. So we know that STEM is perceived as especially unlikely to fulfill communal goals relative to other career fields. Now our question is, does that matter for student interest? So here, the y-axis is going to show you the student's own interest in pursuing these different career fields. And again, the careers are clustered into female stereotypic fields, male stereotypic fields, or the STEM fields. And the x-axis gives a range of how much the groups are, or individuals are endorsing communal goals. How much do they say they personally find it very important to work with others, to be pro-social, to be altruistic? What we see is that communal goal endorsement is positively related to wanting to pursue, being interested in pursuing a career within the female stereotypic cluster. There's no relationship with the male stereotypic careers such as law, business, and medicine. And there's a negative correlation with intent to pursue STEM. So people who are highly communally oriented are the least likely to be interested in a STEM career. And these individual differences in communal goal endorsement can partially explain the gender disparities in interest in pursuing STEM. As I said, these data are correlational, and with correlational data, any number of different explanations might be entering into the action. And so we also wanted to pursue experimental evidence where we randomly assign people to learn about STEM fields in ways that highlight communal opportunity or more of a baseline control condition. So in this manipulation, again, we drew from a wide range of early college students so that they are still in that space, life space, where they're considering different majors. And we randomly assigned them to read about different versions of an early career scientist. We had a cover story where we were working with career services, and we were interested in the kinds of information that students found relevant in making career decisions. And so the descriptions I'll show you were embedded within a few other careers so that students weren't savvy to what we were trying to do. So again, participants are randomly assigned to read about either a more communally oriented science career or a less communally oriented science, more neutral science career. So they read about a kind of a rundown of the day in the life of a scientist. So in this condition, I come in and check my email and plan the day. I have to check a database maintained by the operations group. So this is the neutral condition. In the collaborative or communal condition, we keep many of the tasks the same, but we inject and infuse a bit of communality. So I have to communicate closely with the operations group. Another example, I do data analysis and troubleshoot problems and come up by myself versus I mentor new members of my stats group in doing data analysis. Across both conditions, we're very, very careful to keep the scientific tasks exactly the same and really only changing this communal element because we don't want the more collaborative or communal tasks of the job to be less rigorous or less challenging. So after they're randomly assigned to read about one of these two manipulations, they then answer a series of questions about their interest in all the careers that they read about. But we, of course, are most interested in understanding their attitudes and beliefs about themselves entering a science career. What we found is that the communal framing does boost positivity towards STEM, especially among women students. So here, this is their own positivity towards entering the career. And we see that the communal or collaborative versus the independent framing, that women are more positive towards entering a science career under this collaborative framing, whereas for male students, they're equally positive across both conditions. So collaboration doesn't, decrease or diminish men's interests at all. They're equally positive across both, but for women, injecting that bit of collaboration and communality raised their level of interest to be equivalent to the men. And again, because this is an experimental manipulation, this cannot be explained by anything in the student's own history or experience. It's about what the role is offering. So with this evidence in hand, with some of the foundational evidence that has then led us and others to really dig into and explore the different ways that the different impact of communal information in STEM, who it is relevant to, and where we might see benefits. And so we know that communal affordance, it offers us unique prediction beyond self-efficacy, beyond experience or past history in STEM. So it offers us a new lever to engage students and to engage different students. Another thing that we know with accumulating data, both in our lab and in others, that we certainly started thinking about gender disparities, those binary gender disparities, and working with predominantly white populations. What we know now, after much more research across a wider range of demographic identities, is that we tend to see just big effects of communal affordances, that they boost everyone, and they especially seem to signal something new and different and valuable to groups who have historically been excluded from STEM contexts. And so we can think about both male and female communicators and perceivers, but also thinking about students who are minoritized by race and ethnicity, first-generation students, and so forth. And then finally, as I said, a lot of our work really started within the laboratory because that's where we are located, but we are increasingly seeing more outreach into educational contexts and more empirical work being done to understand what's happening in educational contexts. So that last bit there on the right gives you some information about the different areas where we've seen benefits of communal opportunities and cues out in real educational contexts, ranging from middle school up through college and higher ed. And we also have some data now with STEM doctoral students as well. So the question then, I think, and what I want to turn to now is thinking about how we might demonstrate the cue to students how they can see these environments as affording their goals, what it is that they value. We have in recent years been thinking about this idea of purpose. What do students articulate as their reasons for entering STEM? Do those reasons include both agentic and communal content? And can we use thinking about purpose as a nudge to get students to think about the affordances of their goals in their STEM context? So I'm going to tell you about two different studies today. One is thinking about the effects of directing students to consider purpose in science writ large. So what is the purpose of science as a field? And then secondly, in newer work, we're asking students to articulate their own purpose in the field. And I'll show you some of those data. So considering why science is done, we thought it could be an interesting way to prompt people towards greater communal and agentic goal affordances, because we know that higher levels of abstract thinking tend to push people towards thinking about purpose. And so this comes from scientific theory on construal level by Trope and Lieberman, where they argue that more abstract construals of many different things, of the self, of others, of ideas, leads to more psychological distance and leads to this focus on more consideration of purpose. So drawing from this theoretical framework, we were able to borrow some established experimental protocols that nudge students to think, or nudge participants to think about constructs in either more abstract or more concrete terms. So everyone is focused on a focal task or object, and then you experimentally manipulate kind of whether they're thinking about that in a higher or a lower construal. Our focal task was thinking about scientific experiments. So why is a scientific experiment conducted? Why does a scientist conduct a scientific experiment? And then we randomly assigned participants so that half were thinking in a concrete and low-level way about that, answering those questions, and half were thinking at a higher level, higher construal level, more abstract level about conducting a scientific experiment. So the low-level construal condition is enacted by asking students how. So in this condition, half of our participants were randomly assigned to just answer the question, how does a scientist conduct a scientific experiment? Well, they establish a hypothesis. These are examples from participants. Then how does that happen? Well, you develop an idea of what you want to prove. So iteratively, the student is kind of going narrower and narrower and narrower into why, or into how a scientific experiment is conducted. In the other condition, the other half of our participants were randomly assigned to think about why. So why does a scientist conduct a scientific experiment? To achieve something that is relevant to the world or people in some way. Why do they do that? Because discovering new things and proving them worthwhile matters. And so again, iteratively, step by step, the participants are either going down, 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 or up, up, up in their construal level. After doing that task, we then had participants go back to the content that they had generated and rate it for how communal or agentic it was. And then they also considered scientific careers and rated the communal and agentic goal opportunities in those careers and their own interest in pursuing science. So what we see first is that in terms of the affordances of science, we see that under this higher construal why condition, that science is seen as offering both communal and agentic goals. Whereas in the low construal condition, in that how, when they're diving down, science is seen as less communal than agentic. So this was one of the first indications that we could kind of move students towards generating their own communal content about science. We don't have to tell them that science is different. They can reach those explanations if we direct them towards them. Do these affordances then matter in terms of positivity towards science? And there is evidence that they do. So in these path models, we first looked at this random assignment to think about why versus how science experiments are done. We see that, as I just showed you, that why condition led to more communal affordances, and that in turn leads to the student having more positivity towards entering science. The pathway isn't there for agentic affordances. So in this experiment, the pathway towards more positivity towards science really comes through this generation of communal content in science. Our next step then was to turn to STEM students. So that study, I think, provides causal evidence that considering this why about science can be important in shifting basic beliefs about science and positivity. But in this line of work, and this is work done and supported, one of the primary collaborators is Jay Seth, who is the chief science advocate at 3M. And so in collaboration and with funding from 3M, we're trying to understand the purposes that are articulated by STEM students, particularly in engineering and physical sciences, because that's where we see this early gap in perceiving communal opportunity, and particularly among students from minoritized racial identities. So Black, Hispanic, Native students in STEM. And our question here is to think about how we can create space for students to consider purpose. So does considering purpose elevate these goal affordance perceptions? And then can we demonstrate some benefit to students in terms of their authentic belonging, their feeling that their true self fits into their STEM major? And also in terms of reduced stress. So this is a new dependent measure for us in terms of thinking both about the stressors students are reporting, but also their capacities to handle that stress. And then we're able also to gather a pretty large sample of students who've been excluded or historically excluded groups, minoritized by race and ethnicity in this study. So in this experimental study, we have 466 students, about half from minoritized racial identities and gender balanced within those categories. And here we're randomly assigning students to do a very brief reflection. And this reflection takes one of two forms. They are either asked to write for a few minutes about their challenges in STEM, or to write for a few minutes about their challenges as integrated with their purpose in STEM. And our reasoning for this is that we wanted to recognize and understand that STEM majors are hard, that they are challenging for students, but that they can be especially challenging, perhaps for students who are coming from groups who have not traditionally been represented because many elements of the culture simply weren't built for them. And we wanted to understand how purpose might help students to both grapple with those challenges, but to put them in a useful, more beneficial context. So both prompts recognize that college can be difficult. The purpose reflection, in addition, adds this layer of often those difficulties are worth it if you're doing something that matters. Think about why you decided to become a STEM major, what is it you hope to do with your training, and what's important to you about this pathway. After that, students completed a battery of measures, the affordance beliefs that I've talked about a lot today, but also this measure of authentic belonging in the STEM major and their appraisals of stress relative to their capacities to cope with that stress. So to give you just a glimpse of what students wrote about, because I find it really eye-opening and really inspiring as well. In the challenge condition, what are some of the challenges that people wrote about? This is from a white woman who's in audio engineering, and I think she really eloquently and very explicitly says, I haven't faced explicit sexism or discrimination, but it's always there. It's always subliminally present. And she really captures what in the literature we talk about as kind of the good girl role, these expectations to, be quiet, take notes, be diligent, be conscientious. And she's noticing that her male peers have a wider range. And this last sentence, it's just a different culture. I don't think the male students professors see that it's inherently creating an environment that women are not familiar with or welcome in. So in addition to the challenges of STEM coursework, there's this other layer of culture to navigate. This comes from a first-gen student. I'm low income. I spend a lot of my time working non-skilled labor to make ends meet. It makes it really tough to know what the right step is, what to do next when it comes to my education, because I don't have anyone in family or close social circle to guide me, since I'm the first one to walk this path. In thinking about the purposes that people wrote, and to give you a sliver of a few of these, again, really eloquent and really inspiring. This person, her passion for math is really coming through. It's a heavy workload, but I enjoy math. It's like solving a puzzle. I try to focus on positives, how many interesting applications there are for what I'm learning, and I think of my future salary. So she's very pragmatic in thinking about that. Dominican American, I want to show younger Hispanic kids that they too can be a cool scientist. This person, I would like to work on online products that have a high impact on people across the world. It's important to me to try and make an impact with my work. And there are a million different corners of software engineering that profoundly impact people's day-to-day lives, even if they don't realize it. So one of the take-homes from these very brief purpose reflections is that students certainly can do this. If we give them a little space, they're quite ready to, think about, reflect on, and tell us why they're doing what they're doing and how they see it as mattering. So our question then is, what are the psychological effects of reflecting either on your challenges or on your challenges as integrated with your purpose? And what we see, and as I said, we have the potential, we have the quantitative power, statistical power in this study to detect effects of both gender and ethnicity. What we tend to see, though, is just a whopper of a main effect of purpose reflection. It's very robust. So here I'm just showing you authentic belonging in the major and in career. But if we look at certainty about the major, enjoyment of the major, we see the same pattern. So students who reflected on their challenge are feeling less like they fit in as their true selves in their major, but that brief reflection on purpose elevated that significantly. We see a smaller, marginally significant effect for career, projected authentic belonging in the career, which makes sense because that career is further out from where they are right now. The major is shifting how they're feeling about their major at the moment. We then wanted to look and see whether beliefs about communal and agentic affordances are plausible pathways to explaining this effective purpose reflection on authentic belonging. What we see is that, as I just showed you, this purpose versus challenge experimental condition led to differences in authentic belonging in the major. Purpose versus challenge also led to differences in perceiving communal opportunities in the major, and those in turn predicted authentic belonging in the major. And we also saw a unique and separate pathway through agentic affordances. So reflecting on purpose elevated both communal and agentic affordances for students. Did it equivalently across students from minoritized versus majoritized identities and across gender. And both of these affordances uniquely predicted authentic belonging in the major. We also then wanted to look at stress appraisals. And these data, as I said, are discrepancy scores. And so positive values indicate that the student thinks that they indicate more stress. Like the student thinks their stress is surpassing their capacity to cope, whereas negative values suggest that students think their capacities are actually better, more than the stressors. So what we see is that overall, there's more stress, and this tilts slightly towards the capacity resilience side when students are thinking about purpose. And so again, this shows us a robust effect of this brief reflection of purpose. What we see, though, we wanted to investigate across race and gender. There isn't a significant three-way interaction with this purpose condition, race, and gender, which suggests that this is a tool we can use across race and gender, but looking at the levels by these identities also gives us insight into what is happening, where students are starting and where they end. So what we see is that for white and Asian men and women, the white and Asian men are starting with, barely discernible stress. And when they think about their purpose, they perceive a lot of more capacity than stressors. White women and Asian women are starting at a higher level of stress, and thinking about their purpose is leading them to feel that they have adequate resources to meet those stressors. We see a different picture for minoritized men and women. So here, men students of color are, again, reporting some stress, and purpose is benefiting them so that they're tilting towards that more capacity than stress. But the female students of color are starting with incredibly high levels of stress, and the purpose reflection benefits them, but they're still on the stress side, even after the purpose reflection. And so I think these data are important to consider because this purpose reflection does benefit students across race and gender. We have strong evidence of that, but I think we have to remember that students are starting in different places too. So the playing field is still not level, even with this tool. And so I think that's really important to keep in mind. When we look again to see how communal and agentic affordances are fitting into this picture, we do know that reflecting on purpose is reducing these appraisals of stress. We see that this is not working through communal affordances. So stress is not reduced because people are perceiving more communal opportunity. The stress really is rooted in your sense of having agentic opportunity. And so as much as I am making the appeal that we need to consider communal affordances and elevate those in our STEM environments, I think we also have to remember that students, that agentic motives are fundamental motives too. And those agentic affordances appear to be critical for students' appraisals of stress. Whoops. All right, so those purpose experiments, I just want to wrap up by saying that we know that students can articulate purpose and see goal opportunities when we nudge them towards that. But this shouldn't be up to students, that as educators, administrators, people who hold some authority and autonomy within STEM contexts, we can start to think about how we can signal these opportunities and create space for students to pursue and fulfill these goals in our classrooms. So in this, we're partnering with 3M, with support from 3M, to think about how we can create tools for students, for STEM faculty, to work with students in ways to integrate purpose reflection in STEM. We have both a research arm and an outreach arm of this work in the PRISM project. So this summer, we conducted focus groups with STEM faculty, asking about when, why, how they integrated purpose into any of their STEM courses. We found pretty consensually that usually this is not formally integrated, especially in the larger gateway courses, but that students' purpose and questions about the instructor's purpose do come up in smaller seminars, in office hours, or more informal settings. That often a key hurdle is time and resources. So on that resource front, one of the things we're working on now is to build resources in terms of a toolkit that will be openly accessible for STEM faculty. At the moment, we are co-creating assignments for STEM courses with STEM faculty, and we invite you to join us if you're interested in this. And so in this work, a member of our team is working with different STEM faculty who have an interest to adapt or create assignments for a STEM course that includes some aspect of students' purpose. We are intentionally co-creating with STEM faculty because we understand that we are not the content experts or the delivery experts, and we really need to, the best products and processes will come from partnerships and expertise of STEM faculty, along with the expertise that our lab has in terms of what cues to communality and purpose are and why they matter. Eventually, we'll include these in an open access repository that will offer a lot of different examples across different fields. So to close, I just want to note that there are opportunities and challenges when we start to consider the motives that students bring to STEM and their perceptions and experiences of what motives STEM fields do and do not offer. There are ways to make communality in particular visible and valued. We know from lots of data that agentic opportunities are already visible and valued. So we don't want to diminish those, but we want to create a space for this other important and fundamental aspect of motivation because it's one that's important to everybody, but it's especially important to groups who have historically not been included in the STEM enterprise. As we do so, one of the messages from our data and our gathered work is that we need to gain clarity about what exactly is resonating across different individuals, across different groups, and in different contexts. And so an intersectional lens, not just by race and gender, but also thinking about different aspects of STEM, about socioeconomic status, all of that is really important to consider. There's not a one-size-fits-all solution here. But we can make headway on this. And then lastly, given that agentic motives are so important to students, of course, we need to think about how we integrate communal and agentic opportunities rather than thinking about things we know from students' own perceptions. They see these things as very intertwined. And so how do we bring that forth as educators? So to circle back to where I started in this column op-ed by Jack Leeming, we fundamentally agree that early career researchers should persevere to find meaning in their work. But I would argue, and I hope you agree, that part of this opportunity and part of this responsibility falls to us as STEM educators, as instructors, as administrators, and as people who participate and have some authority in this culture. So to close, I will thank my collaborators, particularly on the PRISM project and with 3M and the National Science Foundation for supporting much of this work, and the many collaborators across the years who have contributed. If you are interested in joining us in co-creating some assignments, the QR code there is where you can get some information, and of course, reach out to any of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Diekman. What an incredible amount of data and depth of data that I'm really grateful to have heard about today. We did have a couple of questions coming into the Slido. So I'll start with one that's pretty specific to one of the studies you talked about. When looking at communal versus agentic activities in the engineering program, were the classes more lecture-based or project-based?
I don't think we coded by that. And that's a good question. I think they were probably pretty evenly split within engineering because the curriculum tends to be lecture heavy on the front end and then more project focused on the back end. But it's possible that they might have been more lecture heavy because we were limited to what was in Canvas. So that is possible.
Thank you. Is there any research on the efficacy of interventions to increase opportunities for fulfillment of communal goals in STEM? For example, participation in learning assistant programs.
So we're starting to collect, or people are starting to collect and accumulate that data, and so far it does seem promising. So one program that I was involved with was the Electronics and Computing Service Scholars, and this was a NSF STEM program at Miami University. And so we recruited engineering students, computer science students, to engage with computer science, with this service orientation and vision. And we did see very clearly in the 2 cohorts that we recruited that we had more women, more students of color at every stage. So they applied more often, they came more often, they were accepted more often, and they came more often, even when we were blind to race and gender as people making admissions decisions. And then the outcomes for those students also tended to be quite good. So we have some evidence, we're getting there.
Great, thank you. What are your thoughts on the influence of cultural aspects in STEM education, and how could it affect the presented data, for example, with developing countries?
That's a great question. And again, one where I would say we need more data. So in one sense, I think it is important to understand the local culture. And so we can think about that. We take a cultural lens broadly in the project where we looked at life sciences versus engineering and physical sciences. Even though we were all within the United States, we were thinking about, well, what are the cultural messages and norms and practices within these different majors and these different physical settings? And so that same logic, I think, would apply across the globe. We would need to understand what is valued and what are the practices of institutions, are interactions structured in this local environment, and then how does that influence individual thoughts and beliefs and actions. And so we don't have specific data, but I think I would start from that cultural framework to understand and dig deep into what are the values and practices within any specific environment.
Yeah, great. Okay. And just one last question. Of the faculty you've discussed your work with, what has their response been? Is there motivation on their end to really incorporate this more into their teaching? Could you say a little bit more about what that looks like?
That's a great question. People who show up to hear what we have to say tend to be people who are at least open and curious about it. I find the most compelling evidence is about student engagement. And so when we, start with the question of, well, do you want to engage more students and students across a broader range, then people are interested in hearing what we have to say about pathways there. And so I think those questions I see them as questions of persuasion and outreach, and I think it's an incremental process. So for us, our strategy is to start with people who are open, who are change ready, and then to understand like what are the barriers in place for them and what can we do to make everything as easy and accessible as possible for those. And then success breeds success, right? And so I think part of it is accumulating evidence and examples and precedent of what we are able to accomplish when you can reach students who you might have thought are unreachable, or who you see as really disengaged or not showing up. And they may not be showing up, but if we try to understand, well, what are their motives? What are the barriers that are in the way? And more clearly signal that the STEM environment, whether it's the classroom or extracurriculars or co-curriculars, that this is one that can afford a wider range of goals, we just have a better possibility of reaching a wider range of students.
Yeah, wonderful. Very well said. Thank you. Let me just double check the chat. Janet, did we miss any questions there? I don't see any.
There's a really interesting new question that just came in the Slido.
Oh, I do see it. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Are there any data on whether different STEM careers actually foster fulfillment in communal goals?
That's a great question. No, it's hard to recruit STEM professionals. I can tell you, it's hard to recruit STEM students sometimes. So we don't have those data. We do hope, so the 3M State of Science Index is one way where we're able to get broader data from a wide range of STEM professionals, but it's not at the level of goal fulfillment in specific careers. So we're hoping at some point to be able to answer that question better than I can at this moment. What I will say is that roles generally, our professional roles, often have a wide latitude in how we can enact them. And there are certainly latitude in how we can construe them. And so that's what we have focused on, is like, okay, we have some data that looks at proactivity, so people sense that they can change their roles. Those data are with students, but we use a kind of core measure of proactive personality. And to the extent that people think that they can create change in their own roles, they also see more communal and agentic opportunities. So again, I think that same psychological process would apply later on in the trajectory and in the workforce as well. Like, to the extent that you actually and that you personally perceive that you can enact change and do your role somewhat differently than has been done before in order to meet your goals, the more satisfied you will be. And so we hope to have more concrete data about that in the future, but there's good reason to suspect that there's at least the possibility of of people enacting goals in different ways. But I will say culture is powerful. So if, like a particular workplace or academic department has always been one way, it takes a strategic and concerted effort to shift that culture. To me, it begins with understanding what some of these processes might be, and then thinking carefully about, well, where might we intervene? Where might we shift things a little bit to broaden, to expand, and to be more inclusive?
Great. And that brings us right to time. So I just want to say thank you again so much for sharing this really exciting research with us. We were really happy to have you today. And just as a brief reminder to everybody else, our next speaker series event will be on Thursday, October 26th at 1 p.m. I've put that information in the chat, and you can find it on the Teaching and Learning Lab website as well. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.